Let's talk about events which shift either the supply or the demand. A common myth is that when sellers benefit because of technology, the buyers are being harmed. So think of some counterexample or argument to that. And your tip here is you can also use this stuff that you learned before, especially in the lesson on trade. So pause here and write down your answer before you proceed. This is a super important concept and at the core of economic thinking. You won't understand and appreciate bottom-up mechanisms unless you fully grasp price signals. And it's very simple and intuitive. It's also a good review of what is a market and how it works. Let's begin. If the price of something is relatively low, what does the law of demand say? And what does the law of supply say? So pause here and write down your answer in your notes. There will be many buyers who will be like, oh no, what happened? They're unhappy since they can't get what they want. Now, how do we fix this? The answer is competition, which is going to drive up the price. Now, as the market price goes up, what happens to the incentives of the sellers? What about the incentives of the buyers? Again, pause here and write down your guess. All you need is the law of supply and the law of demand. Buyers who don't really want it, who have lower willingness to pay, would let go until we reach the equilibrium. So that's one side. What about when the price is relatively high? So for these dots, you need to be able to fill it yourself. Make sure you have complete notes, and you should have as much as what is on the left side for when the price is relatively high. Come on, it's easy and it helps your learning. Jeez. The moral of the story is that the market price conveys valuable information to the buyers and sellers about the scarcity or abundance of something. It's the best incentive to modify their behavior in a way that maximizes efficiency, which means greatest social utility for everyone. And that is the invisible hand of Adam Smith. That's so cool. That is how the market allocates scarce resources efficiently. And for this magic to work, prices should be fluid, not fixed. And newcomers should be welcome in the market. So that is called a free competitive market. I would emphasize in all this the idea of prices as a signal and as a piece of information. You might want to watch this slide again, it's super important, and make sure your notes are complete. A few definitions. We looked at price signals. Let's look at efficiency. It's when something is produced with the least sacrifice, is consumed by the ones with the highest willingness to pay, and without any shortage or surplus. All right, make sure you write down these three conditions and try to use your own words or write a counter example for each to better absorb it. Now, to find the efficient outcome, we need to know all the costs and all the preferences of the people. But no one has such omniscience. That's the main flaw of socialism and why those systems failed so miserably, because it expects the government, a centralized authority, to have all this information. The knowledge is dispersed among millions of buyers and sellers. And that's why we need the market to let that information surface and let the resources be distributed efficiently. So are we out of luck? No, there is a solution which actually works. All it takes is a bit of patience and the ability to let go, not to assume that people are babies who have to be taken care of, not to give too much role to the government who doesn't have the required information. Pause here. Thousands of people die every year waiting for a kidney transplant, a shortage of voluntary donors. The same is true about liver and heart. There is a shortage of space on roads. In many countries, there are a lot of applicants for adoption, but the adoption is very inefficient and full of corruption, and it doesn't go through. So much water is wasted in the farms, and so much garbage is being produced out there. So you might be like, what a mess, what's going on here? In all these cases, we are dealing with a fixed flat price imposed by the government, top down. And when the price of anything is kept low, there will be a shortage. Duh. And then they're managed through a number of ways, which include a long list of waiting, a strict quota system, or an illegal market underground. And all of these effectively mean a higher price in the form of higher opportunity cost for the buyers. So the law of demand is still very much at work, but in a very inefficient and painful way. The free health, quote unquote, free healthcare system in Canada is another good example of a shortage due to artificially low price. Just go to the emergency room once and you'll learn the hard way that there is no free lunch. We are paying a high price for our quote unquote free healthcare. Congratulations, what an achievement. So pause here and take notes on some of these examples and maybe write your own. Having water is a basic human right. It's inhumane to buy and sell organs. Everyone should have access to roads and transportation. What do you think about these statements? Do you agree, disagree, maybe, a qualified answer? These are very appealing on the surface, but quite ignorant of the fact and ultimately flawed. You can think of similar statements about babies and garbage collection. It's this kind of mentality which results in all the shortage and inefficiency that we saw in the last slide. The fact is, none of these value judgments change the reality of scarcity. I don't know how many times I've emphasized this. Sorry for being repetitive, but it's quite a crucial sensitivity that's so missing from public discourse. These are noble objectives, but they can't replace the facts on the ground. Here's another question. Is it wrong to commodify human beings? The answer is, it's not about being right or wrong. We are all literally commodifying ourselves every day, and there is no other alternative. We already saw how we put a price on our life whenever we eat or drink or go on the road. And what's the alternative? Millions of people suffering and dying because no one has the incentive to donate an organ? If human life is valuable, then a market for organs is a lot more humane than relying only on donations. The problem, once again, is a fixed flat price. And the solution is real-time or variable pricing, which means the prices are responsive to peak hours. Listen carefully. The best way to deal with scarcity is a market because of the power of price signals. And in terms of organs, there is one country where there is a market for kidneys, that's Iran. And they've got rid of the shortage problem. It's been quite a success there. It's probably the only thing they got right. Here's a good example. Think of toll roads which vary during rush hours. So you can see up here the prices can be changed according to congestion. This makes people pay for the traffic and pollution externality that they create. And remember the law of demand? It gives them the incentive to not overcrowd the roads when the price is high. Another example is electricity in summer, when everyone turns on their AC and overload the system. So that would be another form of congestion. Too much demand on the grid. The solution is simple and it has been tried and verified. Let the price vary during the day according to the availability of the resource. And of course, this should be communicated to the consumers so they can make informed decisions. And nowadays, with the new technologies, it's very easy and low cost to do so. One who uses a service should pay for it. Duh! Because if the user doesn't pay for it, then someone else must pay for it. There is no free lunch. Oh, wow, that's cool. So there's going to be a shortage unless the prices are allowed to change and we have a dynamic system of pricing. And that's what I want to emphasize in this slide. So pause here and take notes. If you remember, the gist of demand is willingness to pay. How much people would like to pay for something. So then demand shifters or shocks, the same thing, are events which affect the willingness to pay of people, ceteris paribus, assuming that other things are held constant. And we're going to look at some examples of that. One of them, probably the most important one, is taste and preferences. So that would be anything that affects the inclination of people. And there's a whole bunch of applications for that. So for instance, if Beyonce wears a new hat, then everybody would like to buy that new stupid hat, right? And you can see there is a wide range of things like weather, for instance. If it's a hot summer, then people would like to buy more ice cream. And all of them, the way we interpret it is that they influence the taste and preference of people, right? So boycott campaigns for the environment, for instance, again, raising awareness, peer pressure, right? Things like that would affect the people's willingness to pay for a certain good or service, other things being equal. So pause here and summarize it in your own words and try to write your own examples, at least a couple of examples of your own for this shifter. Nice, origami. Sorry guys, I get excited. Another demand shifter or shock is consumption substitutes, and these are things which serve the same purpose. And the classical example of that in economics is Coke and Pepsi. They're similar, right? Or movie tickets and Netflix, right? So I'm going to let you fill in your own examples for the other ones. You can also think of Android versus iPhone. Now the logic here is this: when Coke becomes more expensive, what will happen to the market for Pepsi? The demand for Pepsi will go up, right? Because people will switch from the expensive item to the cheaper alternative. All right. Another shifter or shock is complements. And complements are things that are used together as a package. And a classical example for that would be car and gas, or phone plan and the device. Again, I'm going to let you fill in your own examples for the other ones. The logic here is that if gas becomes more expensive, the demand for combustion engine cars will go down, right? Why? Because the overall package, this is because the overall package is now more expensive. Notice, by the way, that I'm using versus for substitutes because we have either or, whereas for complements, I'm using and because we use both of them together. So pause here, take some notes on the definitions and write your own examples. If two things are substitutes, what it means is that we consume either A or B. If two things are complements, it means that we consume A and B. All right. So or and are the logical operators which are used in programming, and that's a very simple way of remembering the difference between substitutes and complements. Pause here and take notes. When population goes up, other things equal, well, there's going to be more people around to buy anything, right? So there's going to be more demand for any good or service. So that's pretty straightforward. Now, another shifter which is very interesting is permanent income. And notice this has to be lifetime income, not just a one-time increase, because that wouldn't affect consumption habits. And this was a theory developed by my hero, Milton Friedman. Now, here's the thing. If income goes up, what happens to the buyers? What are they going to do? They're going to buy more, right? The demand goes up. But hang on. Can you think of any counterexamples? Is there anything for you that you would buy less of if you had more income? As it turns out, there are two types of goods. There are certain things that we buy more of when we have more income, and there are certain things that we buy less of. All right. So the first group is called normal goods, and most things are normal goods. Most things we buy more of them when we have more income because we like them, we enjoy them, like luxury goods. But there are certain things which are called inferior goods. All right. And these are things that people buy because they cannot afford something better, because they're kind of stuck with it. And usually they're low quality products. But something I want to emphasize is inferior good is not defined by quality. It could have any quality. Inferior good is defined by income, the impact of income. Anything that somebody would buy less of when they have more income would be an inferior good. All right. So some examples would be like used clothes, used books, used anything for that matter. Kool-Aid versus real juice, for instance. My example for inferior good is BlackBerry cell phones. Who buys BlackBerry cell phones? Someone who can't afford Apple or Samsung, right? If they had more money, they would go and get real phone. Oh no. All right, so pause here. Write your own examples for something that's normal for you and something that's inferior for you. These are subjective, so it could differ. Something that's inferior to you might be normal to other people and vice versa. Okay, so take some notes. Wow, that was cool. Whenever the demand goes up, the way we show it on a diagram is by shifting the curve to the right. So you draw your diagram with price and quantity, and you draw a demand curve, call it D1. So D1 means the initial scenario. Then you draw arrows to the right, and you draw a new demand curve and call that D2. So D1 means before, D2 means after, and that's how we show an increase. It's always a shift to the right. Whenever there is a decrease in demand, we shift the demand curve to the left. So again, you start with an initial scenario called D1, and then you draw arrows toward the left, because left means decrease. And you draw a new one to the left of the old one, and you call it D2. All right? So whenever you have a decrease, it's going to be a shift to the left, increase, a shift to the right. Pause here and copy that in your notes. You learn by practice. So let's do some. Let's say we are looking at the iPhone market and we have an initial demand curve, and we are told that there is an event which is it's found that Apple abuses its employees. Now you have to predict what is going to be the impact of this event on our market. What's going to happen to the demand for iPhones if people know that Apple abuses its employees? we can guess, this is other things being equal, we can guess that probably the demand for iPhones would go down. So you're gonna shift the arrows to the left, and you're gonna draw a new curve to the left of the first one. Remember, left means less, all right? And you have to say what is the effect and what is the reason. So this is the part which is kind of important because I need your attention. You have to say the effect is the demand goes down because of what? Because of one of the shifters. So you have to refer to your notes, and I have to emphasize this. You have to refer to your notes. You need to tell me one of the items from the list of shifters that you just learned. In this case, it's going to be consumer tastes and preferences, because consumers' taste and preferences is about their sensitivity, you know, about human rights and so forth. All right, so I did this one for you. The other three ones, you have to do it on your own. Oh, that was cool. So again, we're going to have the iPhone market for all of them. So in one case, you have the long-term income of people goes up. So you have to tell me what is the effect of that and what is the reason. So for the reason, you have to tell me the shifter, and you have to show it in a diagram. So one more time, if it's an increase, you shift it to the right. If it's a decrease, you shift it to the left. For this one, what you do is the event is that the price of Galaxy goes up. How is that going to affect the market for iPhones? Notice that this is not the market for Galaxy, it's the market for iPhones. So what is the effect on the demand and why? Which shifter is affected? And then show it on the diagram. And then the last one is that the price of iOS apps goes up. If the apps become more expensive, how does that affect the demand for iPhones, and what is the reason for that? So take your time, do nice, neat, try to make your diagrams large so that it's neat. Do nice arrows to the right or left, and make sure you have labels, like you have D1, D2, right? All of the label, price and quantity and so forth, and you have the reason for each of them. So take your time so that you'll learn better. Supply shocks are events which make production easier or harder. And remember your ceteris paribus assumption? Now this is a common mistake by students, so heads up. Simplify your life. Look at one thing at a time. There is only one change in the world, and that is the event in the question. So when you look at the production side, assume that there are as many buyers as before. In each step, either look at demand or supply, but not both. At the end, we're going to put them together to have a complete picture. So the first shifter is how much it costs to run a business. And this is not the price of the final product, but their input costs, their maintenance costs. Now, what do you think happens when the operation costs are higher? What happens to the level of production? Well, for the firms, they're not going to be able to produce as much as before, right? One application of that is the wage rate. And remember, the most important factor of production is labor. So that's a very good example that you could get in an exam. Another one are government regulations and requirements which lower production, because hurdles along the way make it harder to run. More taxes add to the cost of production. And the opposite of that is a subsidy, which is when the government helps producers. So tax is when the government steals your money. Oh no, what have you done? Subsidy is when the government gives you free money, like bursaries, child benefit, and aid to farmers. All right. Now, something to watch out for is about this image. So I want you to pay attention to this cartoon. Notice that you have big firms on the two sides, and you have a small firm in the middle. So these are the farms. So subsidies and taxes are often selective. The big, powerful firms qualify for a subsidy or a tax cut because their voices are heard, because they have the incentive and the resources to lobby at the expense of the peasants, right? And the majority have to pay for that. So having a lot of taxes and subsidies tend to reinforce the big corporations and the inequality. That's the whole idea of too big to fail, which is a fallacy because it reduces competition and efficiency. Pause here. Another supply shock is technology. Think of the internet, which made it much easier for companies and employers and employees to communicate. It lowered a lot of costs. And that's really the essence of technology. It makes production faster, which is the same as saying lower unit cost. So per unit is going to be much cheaper to produce, which also means lower cost of living for the consumers. So the companies can expand, which means that they can produce more goods and services, and they can hire more workers. So a common mistake by students is that they say, oh no, technology is going to take away our jobs. Maybe to some extent it can take, the manual jobs and things like that. But technology, because it saves costs for the employers, then they can expand. They can expand and hire more, and they can hire more skilled workers. So technology allows us to specialize and thus become more efficient and also be more competitive in the international markets. Take some notes. Did you see that? It shattered. Do you remember consumption substitutes like Coke and Pepsi? Now what do you think would be production substitutes? substitutes on the production side. And watch out here, guys. This can be a little bit tricky, a little bit counterintuitive. We have an easy time thinking about consumption because we're all consumers. It's easy to relate to. With production, you have to think of yourself as a producer of a given item. So production substitutes are two things that can be produced instead of one another because they take the same ingredients, the same material, right? So here's a bunch of examples. Let's look at the first one. Think of wheat versus weed. I'm not just being funny here. This is actually relevant. Where do they come from? It's a form of farming, right? So you need to have a farmland, right? And you can use your farmland either to make weed or to make wheat, right? So always with substitutes we have or. So as a farmer you have a choice. You have to use your resources in order to make either of these two, okay? In terms of milk and beef, what is the commonality here? What is the input for making milk and beef? They come from the same animal, right? So if you have a cow, you can either milk it or you can slaughter it and produce beef, right? So I want you to fill in the rest. So if you're a producer of leather belts, right, what kind of input do you have and what else can you do with that input? If you're a producer of chairs, what kind of input do you have and what else can you do with that? So that's always the question that you ask yourself. So the logic here is that let's say you're a farmer and you're making weed, and now you learn that you can make more profit by making wheat. So the price of wheat goes up. So if the price of wheat goes up, what are you going to do? As a farmer, you're going to be more attracted to making wheat instead of weed. So the supply of wheat is going to go down because you're going to switch. All right. So take some good notes here and try to fill in your examples, and maybe write more examples if you can think of. Now, what do you think are production complements? Remember, again, in consumption, we had, let's say, coffee and sugar or car and gas. In production, you have to think about producers. You have to think about firms. And again, this is a little bit tricky, so pay more attention. Production complements are things that are jointly produced. These are things that come in nature together. It's always natural, always natural. So that's why it's important to make sure you highlight this or write down. Basically, these are byproducts, all right? So one example of that would be wheat and straw, right? What's going on here? Let's say you're a farmer and you're making wheat. Now, the way the wheat is processed is that it's broken, oh, that's so cool. It's broken down into two things, right? There is the actual grain, which is sold to people, and there is the straw. The straw is used as feedstuff, or the hay, which has usage, right? And farmers sell both of them, right? They come together, right, as a package. Think of lumber and sawdust. If you're a lumberjack, if you have a timber company, what you get is that you get the lumber, but you also get sawdust, and that also has usage, and they sell it. All right. With beef also, you have to think about if you have a cow and you kill it to get the beef, what else do you get? So imagine the cow being like the wheat. You get the beef, but you also get other things. What are the byproducts of it? All right, with cream also, think of the process of making cream. What else is produced in the process? All right. Now the logic here is that, let's say again you're a farmer and you're making wheat. If the price of one complement goes up, let's say wheat becomes more expensive, so you have incentive. The law of supply tells us that when wheat is more expensive, you're going to produce more wheat, but in the process you also produce more straw, you also produce more hay. All right, so both of them go up together. So that's the logic here. Pause here, take good notes, make sure your examples are complete. I would also suggest that you do some drawing. Do a drawing for the last slide for the substitutes, like the wheat and wheat, and also do a drawing here for the wheat and straw, or your own example. The neat thing about graphs is that they have the same law and logic for whether supply or demand. So when we have an increase, we're going to shift the supply curve to the right. You draw an initial supply curve, you draw arrows pointing to the right, and you draw a new supply curve to the right of that. All right. So an increase is always to the right. Okay. If there is a decrease in supply, well, we shift it to the left. So again, you draw an initial supply curve. That's kind of cool. You point arrows to the left, and you draw a new one to the left of the first one, and that is a decrease in supply. So pause here, draw your own diagrams with your own hands. And what that means is that no screenshots, like draw it on paper, or you can draw it electronically, but it should be your own diagrams. Time for practice. I'm going to do the first one for you, and then you'll have the time to do the rest for yourself. So let's say we have a supply diagram for sheep milk, all right? And we are told that the price of lamb goes up, all right? And you have to decide what happens to the supply of sheep milk when the price of lamb goes up. In other words, how does the price of lamb affect the market for sheep milk. All right. Now, if you think about it, if you think of yourself as a producer and you're making sheep milk, and you know that lamb can sell for more, well, you're likely to, sorry for this, but you're going to slaughter the sheep to make the lamb, right? So the supply of sheep milk is going to go down because you're going to switch to the more lucrative option that you have, right? So the supply of sheep milk is going to decrease. It's going to shift to the left. You show it like this, shift to the left. And you explain it by saying that the supply goes down because they are going to switch to a substitute. You can use your own words here, but these are substitutes in production. So we're going to, that's cool. We're going to have a whole bunch of other examples. All of them are about sheep milk. So in the second case, let's think of new milking equipment. And you can assume that new here means better and faster. So what happens when they have better and faster milking equipment? What happens to the supply of sheep milk? So tell me the effect and the cause of it. So for the cause, you have to refer to your list of shifters from your notes, and you have to explain that. Think of extra license requirements to have a sheep farm. How does that affect the supply of sheep milk, right? So what is the effect, up or down, and why? And also remember to shift it either to the right or to the left. And last one, the price of wool goes up. So again, think of the relationship between wool and sheep milk, right? From the supply side as a producer. So what is the effect on sheep milk and because of what? Okay, so make sure you have good explanations and your diagrams have full labels. Today we looked at a number of events which shift the demand curve and also a number of events which shift the supply curve. When there's an increase in demand, we shift it to the right and there will be a shortage because of that. When there's an increase in supply, again we shift it to the right, but then it creates a surplus. If there is a decrease in either case, we shift them to the left. A lower demand will create a surplus, a lower supply will create a shortage. Either way, we are going to achieve a new equilibrium at the end of the day. I would emphasize the idea of the shifts because that's universal, especially when you do graph questions. In terms of the shifters themselves, the shocks, I would emphasize the tastes here, which relate to the willingness to pay very much, and also costs for the producers. So pause here. This is a nice concept map. You can copy this if you want, but also add a few things that were not included here. Look at your list of shifters, and also at the beginning of the lesson when we talked about price signals. How would you update your response to today's myth based on what you learned today? Pause, take a few minutes, look at the concepts that you learned today, and use them to improve your answer. In terms of examples, we can look at self-checkouts, which actually benefit the buyers. We can also look at AI, this is artificial intelligence, which is beneficial to the art producers and also make things easier for the consumers. Basically, technology is all about lower costs of production. And it benefits the buyers because there will be greater quantity produced due to higher supply. So this is the rightward shift of supply. And there's going to be better quality because of the new technology. At the end of the day, this is a non-zero sum mentality, as opposed to the idea that one side benefits at the expense of the other, which is a zero sum mentality. Have a great day.